Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Ensuring the Success of Your Informatics Projects with Business Process Analysis. Next slide, Randy. Randy, you can go ahead and advance the slide. Thank you very much. So again, today's session is brought to you by Astrix Technology Group. And before we get into the presentation, we want to share a little bit of information about who Astrix is and why we think we have the rights to be speaking about these topics today. First and foremost, Astrix is an informatics professional service and staffing company that's dedicated exclusively to serving the scientific community. A couple of quick stats about the company before we get into the session. Astrix was established in 1995 and is privately held. It originated in the IT division of APBI, which is a $300 million life science research organization, operating 8 offices throughout the United States with over 500 employees, but our headquarters is in Red Bank, New Jersey. Astrix has a staffing division, which offers private and public staffing of scientific and IT resources, as well as professional services division, which is focused on supporting science-based organizations. The target customer for Astrix is life science enterprises, governments, research institutions with large and fast-growing IT, staffing, and compliance needs. And the mission of the company has always been to deliver scalable, sustainable solutions in IT and staffing for the scientific community. Next slide, Randy. The company foundation is one in which we help clients excel and solve very complex problems with a combination of the right people and the right technology. This includes staffing with scientific backgrounds, practical bench experience, broad subject matter expertise, and you're going to hear from one of those folks today. Laboratory management, laboratory operations, and managed services round out our professional services offerings, as well as scientific laboratory application expertise and industry standards development and database tools on the technology side. I'd like to tell you a little bit about our speaker for today. Randy, you can go to the next slide. Randy Hice is a managing director of business analysis at Astrix Technology Group, and he comes to us as a former manager of global strategy at Abbott Informatics. He brings more than 3 decades of experience with laboratory informatics and is the most published author in the world on laboratory automation. So we're obviously very thrilled to have his expertise with Astrix and having him present to you all today. He's developed laboratory workflow analysis in 1988 while at Digital Equipment Corporation. And with that, Randy, I'd invite you to come on, do a quick sound check, and then we're going to go ahead and pass the presentation to you.
Hi, I hope everybody can hear me. Welcome. Glad everyone could attend. Very happy to be joining you this morning, my time, and talk a little bit about business process analysis and what it might mean to your company. Playing off the last slide that we just saw, I got exposed to laboratory workflow analysis and laboratory business process analysis as part of Digital Equipment Corporation because they had a LIMS system at one point, decided to get out of the business, and suddenly we had a whole bunch of customers that had to be moved from the digital system to a new system, and we needed a logical, systematic way of doing that, of figuring out what the requirements were and being able to do it quickly. So that is one of the reasons that precipitated the development of this kind of analysis. And so it was actually developed more as a defense mechanism than anything. But getting into the criticality of it, we really have to understand the current state of a company's processes. Lots of times we'll go in and we'll talk to a customer and just say, look, we know our current processes are bad. We just want to jump right to the future state environment. But that's impossible to do for a couple of reasons. For one thing, if you short circuit the process and move on directly to a future state environment, you have no idea where the opportunities for process improvement are. You have no idea what things are not working in the organization that could possibly be fixed with the advent of software. So understanding the current state environment also allows us to set a baseline, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. We'll talk about the fact that often when we're getting ready to work with a client on this kind of activity, we get sent a lot of workflow diagrams from the client, and they're frequently not at the right level. We'll dive down into that for in a couple of minutes here. We'll also address why sometimes external resources can succeed where others have failed. Sometimes the answer to that is largely political and not technical. And finally, we'll talk about why using this kind of a controlled process can save time, money, and in some cases, careers. So no matter what you hear, the bigger the project, the more problems occur. Every vendor of systems, and we'll be talking a lot about LIMS today, but the same kind of analysis applies to other informatics systems, electronic lab notebooks, clinical laboratory information systems. Those kinds of things all fall under the same kind of approach that we use here. But you may hear me talk about LIMS quite a bit because we've done hundreds of workflows attached to LIMS projects. No, and every vendor who has ever implemented a project has some bad stories, some bad results out there. And one thing that's traceable back to those problems with these accounts is that the requirements were probably not captured at the proper level, and there were a lot of hurt feelings as we went along. One very famous thing I heard in a meeting in which I was attending a vendor demo a few years ago was they were saying to senior management, you know, we don't implement your system as much as we mentor you how to implement it. That's a very intoxicating message for a lot of clients because it sounds like a huge time savings and a huge money savings, and that you're going to get right to the implementation. But it's actually a cover your backside kind of issue that comes from the vendors, because they put the responsibility for system design and implementation squarely on the backs of the customer, a customer who probably doesn't understand the capacity of the system. So improperly configured requirements are one chief problem. So we're going to get into these in a little bit more detail in the course of the discussion today. We already talked about targets not defined. That's a little bit interesting in itself, because 90% of the projects we've seen, companies are getting ready to spend a sizable amount of money to implement a laboratory informatics system, and they never capture their current state environment in terms of metrics. So they haven't developed a baseline. They haven't developed a baseline for what it takes to get a test out. They haven't gauged the number of samples that have moved through the organization, and so forth. So without establishing a baseline, there's problem number one. Very, very few customers do this. All they do, they justify the expenditure, the purchase of these systems, largely on the fact that there's an intuitive feeling that there's going to be a huge productivity increase, but yet there's no metric there to be able to measure it. Resource requirements being underestimated is also a common roadblock that we come to, and we'll have a little bit more in-depth discussion about that. We hate seeing vendors get selected for the wrong reasons. We hate seeing clients go through an organized, systematic process for vendor selection, but then in the final analysis, they get exhausted from seeing 3, 4, 5 vendor demos in a few days' time, and they're all glazed over, and they're so frustrated, they're so tired, they just go ahead and select the one that demoed the best without really having a systematic table for recording responses and comparing apples to apples between the vendors. We already talked about the fact that requirements at the wrong level are a big culprit in failed projects, or projects at least that are delayed, over budget, and so forth. We'll look at the process of how we apply business process analysis to get those requirements tuned in at the right level. Overall business objectives are not understood. So it's also interesting, the very first thing when we go in and help a client out, we like to talk for a little bit about where the company is, where they've come from, what their objectives are, and what their objectives are for the system. And it's interesting how we get down to that level of a question, and the objectives for the system are so nebulous that it's hard to miss them. Okay, if you're the manager in charge of the project, that could be good, but it's not necessarily the best thing for the company. A word about vendor demo narcosis. This is a term I invented to talk about the fact that it's too bad when we sit in and watch a vendor demo that the most colorful screens or the jazziest bells and whistles and so forth win the day. And it does nothing to talk about improving the process or improving the lives of the people using the system. And so people, again, this is selecting a system for the wrong reason, primarily on flash and so forth. And so we want to try to avoid that, and the system that we're going to discuss today will do that. So you can't hit a target that's not defined. we can see when we talk about objectives for employees and companies, frequently you see measurable objectives and so forth. We might see objectives when we walk in and talk to a client for the first time, replace a current system by October, when a very precise measurement would be, look at, we're going to roll out different sites, we're going to do it in 60-day cycles, and this is how it's going to happen. The lab efficiency metric here is tied to what I said earlier about having a baseline. You can't possibly gauge whether you improved 15% unless you knew what the starting line was. So we highly encourage capture of current state environments. Improving compliance, yeah, it's a great term in regulated environments, but what does that mean? Mostly it means a fear of being able to defend against, say, an FDA audit or something like that. But specifically, what does that mean? It means implementing certain features that allow a company to employ their compliance program. So it's interesting that if we look at 3 basic objectives for using business process analysis, we do want to actually accurately capture the current state environment with all of its warts and inefficiencies, just for good or ill. We want to understand what's going on, okay? Because it's not enough to just look at an environment and say, we know we have to improve. We'd like to see where the problems are occurring. Because when we get to objective 2, if we can design a future state environment and we have user buy-in, we're going to be able to leverage the latest technology and functionality that we're aware of in the different client applications that we're going to be able to deploy. User buy-in is highly underestimated, because users, if you think about it, the bench level user, yeah, they have a certain job to do. If the system does not allow them to do their job more efficiently, they're not going to be drawn to it. You're going to have resistance, and you don't want that. If we're able to work on a process that abstracts the requirements up to a level where we're talking on a business level rather than a familiarity with a past system, if we talk at that level, then the users are able to articulate things that were wrong in the system. We often say, look, if you've ever complained about the systems in use here and the way work gets done, you have no right to complain after this if you don't bring them to the table. Because what we want to do is we want to draw on the collective brilliance of the people that understand the business. And we'll dive into that in great detail when we get into the process. The last thing is, people will, if they don't use the system, passive resistance comes into play. And they often will revert to whatever process they used before and just not tell anybody. We were at a company several years ago, a polyolefins company. And one of the complaints is that they purchased requests to buy instruments. NMRs, as you know, are not cheap instruments, and this was a huge budget hit. And they just couldn't understand why they were having to buy new NMRs all the time. And as we looked in the 2B environment, we got honest answers from the people doing the work. What we found out was that the current system was really cumbersome. People got put in the queue to get their samples run on the NMR. And so what they did is people that had inside connections to the NMR operators were slipping samples in the back door and just say, hey, I'll buy you a beer if you run this sample today. I really need it. Well, that's what we call black market workflow. And once we were able to identify that workflow, we went to management and said, look, you don't have an instrument problem, you have a people problem. So what we need to do is we have to get some discipline in the system and use the system, and then you'll be able to accurately gauge what the workload truly is on your NMRs. Finally, we want to be able to extract precise requirements that reflect upon agreed upon improvements in the business process. From there, we can focus vendor evaluations, vendor demo scripts, actual project plans, and so forth, all based on the future state environment that we have. If we've gone along through this process in a systematic fashion, people are already bought into it because they help shape the future state. So when we look at process mapping, of course, you've heard me harp on the fact that current state environment process maps have to identify inefficiencies and wait states. We'll kind of look at an example for that, but a word about that. When we look at a current state environment, we're always casting an eye to the future. We're always looking at, we're making sure that we capture the requirements at the right level, a level that can be fixed through the advent of software or process changes that have nothing to do with software. So current state process, one of the things that we see that kill productivity the most are what we call ambush samples. Ambush samples are things that show up on a user's desk the first thing in the morning. The starting gun goes off at that point. When the starting gun goes off, that person or team has to start getting instruments equilibrated. They have to start preparing things like mobile phases and reagents. They have to label samples, get glassware, actually go and obtain the samples and so forth. We figure that if we can spot those in a current state environment and head them off at the pass, the more advanced notice that we can give users, for example, of upcoming work, so that they can see the day before, or the work that's coming through the queue that's going to hit them. There are certain activities, certain thankless activities that can be done in advance. The glassware prep, the label preparation and generation, and that kind of stuff. If you give people notice, they can fill in dead space while maybe other samples are running and things like that with those mundane tasks, but at least they won't be doing it when the samples show up. So that's one example of a advanced notice. Wait states are whenever we ask people, look at how did you know that you had this work to do on this day? And they just said, look, it just showed up on my desk in my inbox. And then somebody has to wait to get the paperwork and so forth. Anytime we can eliminate wait states, that's a good thing. So we can do those with the advent of software. And as we mentioned, as-is maps not only serve as a model for developing the future state environment, but when we do get to the future state environment, we use that for all sorts of nice things. They can be used for training for new personnel. They can be used to generate the system requirements. The system requirements are thus linked through the systematic process and allow for very precise requirements to be given to vendors. So when we get to the 2B state, we want to map project process improvements and optimize environments. And again, this is where we engage the people that are working on a daily basis with these systems. And again, we just say, look, we want to understand what you perceive the problems to be. We capture that during the as-is environment, but now we try to incorporate those into the 2B environment. So 2B state maps specifically define system requirements. We'll call those out. Not everything defined in a future state environment has to do with software. You can just make some things more efficient by creating a team that does nothing but sample handling and so forth. And we see that a lot. Rather than have PhD scientists walking around looking through refrigerated rooms to find samples, maybe a sample delivery group is the better move here. So those kinds of things will typically fall out of the future state environment. So system requirements that are accurately identified become vendor requirements, and they're constrained to the business process improvements that everybody has got buy-in to. So it's not the bells and whistles. We talked about the vendor demo narcosis earlier. So what we want to do is eliminate that by tightening down the frame for what we're trying to improve. That way we can conserve project budget. We don't spend money on things that we haven't all agreed bring business benefit. So one thing we talked about is that lots of times when we walk into meetings or before we come on site, we ask clients to provide us with examples of anything that they have, for good or bad. What kind of workflows have you done internally and so forth? This one seems simplistic, it seems almost condescending, but it is absolutely representative of a flow that was handed to us by a customer. I've seen an entire microbiology department's workflow represented by 4 or 5 boxes, and we know that there's more to that. We also know it's not attenuated to the right level that we need to make any kind of process improvements. So if it's done at this kind of high level, it's basically kind of a waste of space. It might be something for very high level discussion of an operation, but beyond that, it doesn't allow us to differentiate one vendor's offerings from another. It doesn't allow us to figure out what the problems are and so forth. So 90% of the time that we see workflows provided from a client, they are at too high of a level. In some cases, in rarer cases, we get requirements that are defined at too minute of a level, down to the dilution regimen for samples and those kinds of things. Yeah, those are great if you're training the new person that's been hired to work in the lab. They're not so great if you're trying to use it at the right level for discerning requirements for system selection. So I know that you can't read this, and that's intentional, but this was just an actual capture. It's a genericized version of an actual customer workflow. This is current state environment, by the way. That's why all the boxes are white, and it's an important point we'll talk about in a minute. But all of these boxes get down into exactly what happens when, in this case, when samples shown up, how they're identified, how tests are affiliated with them, what has to happen, how notifications are handled, and so forth. If we zoom in on this, and again, there's no need to be able to read this right away, but you can see that it takes this level of detail to define a current state operation. Now, there's a method to the madness here. So as we look at the next slide, we're going back to that big monolithic kind of workflow that we just saw. Just for the purpose of example, I'm going to call out a couple of functions in here. These are current state functions, and we're looking at a couple of processes. So when we walked through this lab, we saw that everything to do with instruments was being handled manually. So we were looking at standards that were being prepared, reagent information is being handwritten on data sheets. We looked at the fact that analysts had to record all sorts of entries in the instrument logbook, the fact that they're using a particular instrument. In this case, we're talking about chromatography columns. They had to register the column they were using. They had to register the reagents they were using, because if you think about it, in a regulated environment, an FDA inspector could come in and ask to see exactly this stuff. And in fact, when we talk about fear of compliance, just this kind of thing happens when FDA inspectors come on site, and they want to look and they want to see that these methods were being followed as per SOP and so forth. So they would actually go in and spend days looking at these logbooks. Well, thinking forward, when we get into the future state environment, if these things are available in the context of a software system, you can come in and generate a report that generates all of this information for a particular instrument in a matter of seconds. So there is an opportunity for process improvement. Now, in that case, it was designed out of fear of a compliance issue. In the case that we're working on here, we see real opportunity to make people more productive. So when we go to a future state environment, in this particular case, this workflow right here is the exact same workflow that has now been simplified in the 2B state. And I think it's really important. I want you to look at this for just a second. We're going to get down to that little circle in the middle of this diagram. But if you look at the complexity of this, and we look at the complexity of this, notice a difference? So the difference is there were a whole lot of opportunities for process improvement that we came to understand in this current state environment. So when we went down and defined the 2B environment, what we did is we tried to simplify and consolidate processes. And in this particular case, this happened to be a customer that had multiple sites. They had sites actually in several different countries. So we wanted to use this as a means of consolidating operations. So sites did the same kind of processes the same ways. And when we get into talking about independent consultants being the people in the middle to serve as unbiased consultants, it becomes even a greater need when you start to work with multiple sites, because there's a natural kind of competition in some cases, and in some cases an animosity that is technically not a problem but organizationally a problem. So when we look at big global sites and trying to consolidate operations, because remember that most of the modern day informatics systems, whether they be ELN, whether they be LIMS, whether they be clinical LIS systems, these are systems that are based on central servers and they're accessed by web browsers. Well, back in the old days, in the early ages of LIMS and these kinds of systems, those were all client-server systems. A lot of progressive companies thought that it's a good idea to have processes at different sites being executed in the same way. So when they turned to thinking about that, it had to be largely by agreement and not by an absolute technical need. When you have a centrally served system, you're working off the same executable image. So that system has to be able to accommodate the workflows of different sites. So now the need for the harmonization of activities and so forth becomes realistic. It becomes something that's a necessity and not just a want to have. So if we looked at we extracted from here. So in this circle right here, we went back to our previous problem. You remember the problem about instruments logging and the logbooks and so forth? We improved it in the 2B model. And I want you to look at this for a second. So we addressed the problems that we identified by creating a LIMS run. In this case, we're going to select the instruments, we're going to add QCs. We're all doing this in the context of software now. It had to be done physically in the previous workflow. We're going to enter any of the required run information. It may include equipment IDs, any consumables, and metadata associated with the sample. And we might print a run sheet that's going to dictate what we're going to do with those samples. Now, if you look to the right, these three boxes yielded very precise systematic requirements. So we get down to the level of the LIMS sample runs, and I'm not going to read through all of these, but they must provide a selection of primary instruments from a pull-down list of available instruments on the local area network. Must allow the selection of samples to be included in the run from a shared laboratory workgroup backlog. These are requirements that are extremely detailed. When you get down to asking a vendor to respond to a request for proposal, or actually when you get to the point of incorporating these into vendor demo scripts, these are the kinds of things that can't be answered ambiguously, and you don't want that. And believe it or not, vendors don't want that. Many people think that in some cases vendors are really coming in and they're blustering and they want to talk about things that they can accomplish any task. They will naturally do that if you don't have precise requirements. But when we talk to vendors behind the closed doors, they like to have precise requirements because they don't have to rely on telepathic abilities to figure out what the customer's trying to do. So when our requirements documents come out, yeah, they're very detailed. They're extremely difficult in some cases and require a lot of thinking. And it requires vendors not to cut and paste responses into documents. But on some levels, they say, well, look, we want our application to battle head to head in a fair environment. And if we respond to very specific requirements, we know the people that we're bidding against have to do the same thing. So in many cases, honorable vendors will want very precisely defined requirements because that allows them, and most are very, very proud of their applications. And they want to show off what their applications can do. And they love being asked specific questions. They'll incorporate these into demos, and they'll show you exactly how these requirements are done. Now remember, where did we get to this spot where we are? We started with a really big, unwieldy as-is diagram. From there, we've pulled a few boxes and we've identified those in the future state environment. So we designed a future state that optimized that entire as-is diagram. And this is just an excerpt. This is what we call a snippet on the left. This is a snippet of a workflow. Remember, there's going to be a whole bunch of snippets, and snippets define what has to be done in terms of requirements. So we've gone from an environment of a as-is environment with a bunch of warts on it. We did process improvements in the 2B environment through software and through just making changes in how the laboratory handles samples and those kinds of things. With the users engaged, we helped define the 2B state and worked with them and to define the environment, which now resulted in an agreement between all the users and management. This is how we're going to work. And so when we got to that point, we have now logically worked into a system of very defined requirements that came from a collaborative effort that led us to this point. So raising it back up to not 30,000 feet, but 5,000 feet for a second. When we look at what we do here, so we looked at current state process flows. We work with subject matter experts, supervisors, and even some management through an interview process to discern what the current state is. We developed the future state off-site, and the reason for that, and we'll get into future state, but a lot of the future state developing off-site is because if you don't know the kinds of things that the current modern systems bring to the table, it's a little hard to sit in a room the same way you did in the as-is environment and sit there and say, well, look, this is how we're going to work in the future state. What do you want to do? Well, if people don't have an understanding for the capacity of what these systems bring to the table, it's an unfair question to ask them, how do you want to configure the future state? That goes back to what I said earlier about vendors saying, look, we don't implement systems, we mentor you how to implement systems. They come in sometimes on a first day and they'll have a 1-hour kickoff meeting And then the developers will sit there and say, okay, start feeding us your report structures, start feeding us your sample list, start feeding us your instruments, and we'll start throwing that into the software. If you do that, you are adhering to the workflow that's inherent in the system, and you're not doing anything for process improvements. So we don't like that approach. We think it's a much better use of your time and money to go through this process, which helps you narrow in on system requirements that are built on business requirements indigenous to your environment. So these are not the generalist kind of requirements that the product brings to the table. These are requirements specifically tailor-made for your environment. So that way, project dollars that are hard fought and hard to get approved are focused on those things that everybody up to this point has agreed bring business benefit to the company. So we talked a little bit about the political aspect. When another set of eyes makes sense. A lot of our clients have a lot of very bright people working in the company. They're good systems analysts. They're good business analysts. They're project management professionals working in companies. Yet they run into problems, and they run into problems lots of times. They're political rather than technical, but in some cases it's because perhaps not understanding the capacity of what modern systems bring to the table. But there are ways of getting around that. And sometimes having an outside set of eyes, consultants, such as those of us at Astrix, you're perceived as being unbiased. So we had a customer that had a major operation in the United States, had another operation very similar in nature in Switzerland, and they couldn't have been more different. They couldn't have had, there was a huge resentment of the Swiss location about being dictated to by the Americans and so forth. And so they were butting heads all the time. And so what we brought to the picture was an air of neutrality. Of all people, the Swiss should understand neutrality, right? But they didn't in this case. And so when we came on site, we said, let's just talk about what business requirements you have. Because they were using one system in one country and one system in another country, everybody thought that they were doing things the best way. What we wanted to do was say, look, let's not focus on software. Let's not focus on the solutions that you're using. Let's focus on the business problems that we're trying to solve and come to an agreement about what's the best way to work. Because look at folks, we're all going to be operating off the same system. Let's figure out what functionality has to be developed that satisfies, sites on both sides of the ocean. That surprisingly kind of lowered the blood pressure of a lot of people. It allowed us to come in and serve as unbiased intermediaries. And we were able to come in there and talk about an environment that made sense. There's another reason that sometimes bringing in consultants or third parties, because for good or ill, a lot of customers are going through their first, second, or third laboratory informatics deployment. But in many cases, people are seeing software for the first time, or their total frame of reference harkens back to functionality that they've seen in a product that might have been deployed in the early 90s or something like that. Systems change. It's our business to understand all of the vendors. We go to vendor conferences. We get exposed to training. We want to know what they're trying to promote in their system, what kind of enhancements they're bringing to their world. If we understand those, we can better present them to our customers. And there's another point here. In understanding where being exposed to a lot of customer projects, I don't care how smart you are in terms of understanding systems. You might be the most technical people in the world. You're not going to have the creativity that can match exposure to hundreds of customers. So that means that customers who have been put under fire, they have had to work and develop workarounds or the ability to address specific problems and so forth. They have been exposed to problems at a real visceral level that are real to them, and they needed to solve these because in many cases their profitability, their careers and so forth were hinged on solving those problems. Well, if you multiply that by the number of customer sites that we've walked through, and our people collectively have walked through hundreds and hundreds of sites, you start to build a portfolio of how smart customers have creatively applied these systems to their environments. We have both a physical and mental record of those implementations, and we see things that look awful familiar because we've seen them 5, 10 times before. And what we want to try to do is draw on the collective wisdom of our customers who have had to fight these battles at great length and at great expense, and try to bring them to a benefit to our new clients. So it all works like that. And if we come in and help your site, what we learn from your people and your problems and your resolutions and so forth are things that we're going to pay forward to other customers as well. So our specific approach is probably a little different than a lot of customers, how they do this internally, but it's also different than how some other consulting agencies might work. What we try to do is we have some discussions before we ever set foot on site to determine the project scope and the sites that are involved, the personnel, their current skill levels. We try to gauge management dedication to this product. We try to understand what budget's available. We want to know how many groups, how many people are using this system at different sites or are going to use the system. When we bring a team on site, we do those as-is flows. We do that by capturing, we do them actually by diagramming them in real time. Nobody's fast enough with things like Visio to develop workflows on site with a bunch of people looking at them and discussing how things go. You can't edit these things on the fly. Good old-fashioned white dry erase boards are the best way to go. So we develop those, and for people like me, if I've done this, you don't want to rely on my handwriting in the file analysis. So eventually we're going to take those workflows and we're going to render them into Visio. Meanwhile, we have a team of people, because as we're capturing, we're listening to the things and the thoughts that are coming from the customers that as we're building the flow. So we know what the concerns are. We know what we're trying to get to. We try to capture real time where the direction of some of these things are going, so we incorporate those into the future state environment. So when we get around to developing that future state, as we mentioned before, we close ourselves in our offices, we get a lot of black coffee going, we turn off the phones, and we start thinking about this at great length. How can we bring improvements to this workflow? All right. And so we come up with a 2B workflow. Now, we're not dictating to anybody that this is how things have to happen. What we're producing is a straw model. That straw model is in a Visio form. And what we do is we send those Visio models up a few weeks before we come back on site to discuss these in real time. But we tell people, look, we're not emotionally attached to these. We try to get as close as we can. But when we come on site, we want you to beat up on these if you see something that doesn't work. And we'll get things like, you know, guys, you're making a lot of work for us because Sue and Don work elbow to elbow. Why should they have to go through preparing this list, issuing it, sending an incident message, or whatever it is, when he can just turn to Sue and just say, look, here's what I am. Can you help me with this? Right? So we're not going to implement and design workflow for the sake of using every little bell and whistle in the system. We're only going to try to solve problems. And that's what you should do if you're applying the same kind of methodology internally. So once the future state models have been reviewed, then we come on site and we sit there and we listen, and what we try to understand is what works, what didn't work. And amazingly, I think that the success rate, the accuracy rate on the 2B models is frequently above 90%. We see less than 10% changes to these models. What we do see, you know, at the beginning of this process, when we develop the as-is environments, a comment that has been made at about 100% of our customers is when they see the environment for the first time depicted in a workflow, they say, you know what, we didn't realize how messed up our processes were. You know, this is really, really helpful. When we get to the stage of a 2B workflow, folks are saying, look, we didn't understand that these systems actually do that these days. And this is really, really cool to see. So this helps form that logical circle of life where we've gone from that current state environment through the requirements, vendor selection. We can also use this information to get to the point of developing project plans and so forth. Going back to our initial site with all the poor penguins, you know, dancing around on a minefield. This is in the Falkland Islands and so it's actually really a diagram. It's meant to depict the kind of problems that we see. And speaking of mines, we'll divide them into 4 different categories here. Lack of management buy-in and investment. That was on our roadmap earlier in the presentation. We talk about political issues. We've talked about faulty processes, and we talk about resource issues. I don't know why this gentleman, I used him to define an unreasonable manager because he died before I was born, but one thing that we understand and a problem that we see is that there's not enough time being allocated to people that are working on the project. We like to see internal project managers who their whole life is going to be tied to this project, and so they're dedicated to it. They're not doing it on a heap of 5 other projects. We often run into problems where we get discussions early on in a project where, you know, why are we even going and looking at vendors of ELN, of LIMS, of clinical LIS? You know, we have a huge ERP system in here, and our ERP rep says that their system can do all this LIMSy stuff. Well, we hear that a lot, and unfortunately, we've never seen it work out successfully because large ERP systems that have LIMS-like functionality, remember in 100% of the cases, the ERP systems were in place to begin with. Not a person in the world ever bought an ERP system because it had LIMS functionality. So this is kind of a why leave the money on the table kind of thing, and it's probably not a good way to go. If you go through the requirements that we listed, if you go through the process that we've been talking about, that would expose systems that are bad fits. You know, in the rare cases where a high-level manufacturing operation is using an ERP and they're just doing sort of batch-level checking and that kind of stuff, there is an argument that can be made for using the quality management module of some of these systems. It's not very common, but either way, we don't have a dog in the race. We don't care what vendors get selected. What we care about is that the solution that you do select is in the best possible position to bring productivity increases and conserve project budget. So if it's an ERP system and they can fight their way through the battle and answer the requirements document, and everybody feels that, look, this vendor did a great job of addressing these, they are actually a fit for us, that's fine. We couldn't be happier. But it's just an indicative of the fact that if you go through a systematic process, you can be sure that by the time you're getting down to the final 2 or 3 vendors that are going to be called into demo, by that point, you're pretty well far down the continuum, and you're pretty sure that they're going to be able to handle the problems. There's also a misunderstanding about how much budget's required for these projects. So we have to understand that you know, it's bigger than a bread box. We want to know right away. So if we hear up front, look, we've got 4 sites to implement, and you know, our management's been very, very gracious. They've granted us $100,000 for the entire project, including purchase of software. I'm not being facetious here. We've heard things to that scale before. We're saying, well, look, we're going to have to talk about this because for what you're trying to do, we're going to have to limit our expectations here because it's going to be difficult to do it for that kind of budget. So if you have to go and do a revisiting the budget allocation, we should talk about what's really going to cost or talk about scaling scope back. Okay, there's also unrealistic expectations sometimes about time. This happens a lot, and this is why there's sometimes impatience in some companies in spending a lot of time on current state models. We've talked about all the reasons why they're so good, but in a lot of cases they say, look, you're slowing us down. Let's just get and design this new product, get it in here because we've got to get this done in 4 months now. We've been horsing around with it for over a year. We don't even have a vendor in here, but let's get it done. We're going to have this system purchased by May. We need it done by August. And if we can't be honest with customers and talking about that and saying, look, we can work with a triangle of budget, time, and functionality. Which one do you want to scale back on? You either increase the budget, but at some point, you know, you can throw all the king's horses and all the king's men at it, and you're not going to get all the functionality in that time frame. You can extend the time frame if you can get people to think reasonably about that, or you can dial back in the functionality. So it's kind of a triangle that you have to work with, and there are really not too many alternatives to it. We talked about the political issue. Not invented here is often a problem, especially in multi-site projects. And I have literally extracted this from some companies I worked with in the South, again, an oil and gas company. And the names have been changed to protect the innocent, but literally we had a plant manager say, what is so-and-so doing at the other plant? We said, well, you know, they're going around, they're looking at this system. And they said, well, whatever they get, we don't want it. And it sounds unreasonable, but everybody probably understands that politics play more of a role than we'd like them to play. In some cases, there's a personal resentment towards somebody that's is viewed as having a political agenda, and people talk very ill about those people, and they don't want them involved with directing the project. In some cases, there are people that have pet software or pet operating systems, or something's in play that's unreasonable in the modern environment, and they want to stick to it. And so if we're going to be honest, we're going to have to talk about these things as independent. Don't have a dog in the race. We're just going to give it to you like it is. Bad processes are evident everywhere we go. Sometimes we talk about the fact that, and you've heard me talk about it frequently in this discussion. You come in and the very first thing you get is, look, we've been using such and such a LIMS system. We got it in 1992. It is really beyond end of life, but there are certain things our users must have in that system. We just want those to be the requirements for the new system. Okay. Well, by now, in talking about this today, we know that if you do that, you're doing what in the old days in Boston. Anybody that's ever driven in Boston, you drive around the downtown area and wonder why so many of the roads just curl around upon themselves and so forth. In the old days, there are some areas in Boston where they literally paved roads over cow paths. And the cows just kind of meandered around down hills and things like that. So things go all the way around. If you're just electrifying and speeding up bad processes with a new system, you're just going to have faster working bad processes. And so you're not exploiting the kind of functionality today's modern systems bring to the table. So it's important to follow this down to the last detail. Let's go through a process of defining and figuring out how we can improve the work environment, how we can improve the lives of the people using these systems. Okay, we've seen systems selected for exactly the wrong reasons. I make a joke here about the Armani suit. I'm telling you, I was in a site out in Utah at one point, and what we do when we help facilitate vendor demos and so forth, we sit back because we want to know how customers have viewed a vendor demo. And how a customer perceives a demo is different than how people that work with this stuff for a living perceive a demo. But we don't want to drive. We don't want to influence. We want an honest opinion. What did you see? The first thing that was told to us after a guy walked out was, man, did he look bad in that sport coat? And there was some sort of linearity between their assumption that a bad sport coat meant that he was somehow being disingenuous about the system and that they weren't going to be able to do the things that they said they were going to do. And so we had to kind of jump in and say, you know what, I think we probably need to draw this back to the functionality. How did you think about how they handled stability? You know, how did you think how they did this? And we did just say, look at, this also comes back to what's the measurement process, right? If you don't look at vendors apples to apples, people tend to fall back to a frame of reference they understand. They fall back to the system that they previously used. And so they use that as their decision criteria. So when developing decision sheets and those kinds of things, when you're going through vendor demos, they have to reflect the requirements that they came out of this process. And we have to define, hey, what does it mean to have met this requirement? What does it mean to have missed it? Sometimes we go in and we understand, and people say, well, look, we've got a veritable army of people that we're going to apply to this project. And we start asking, okay, great. The more we can use your people, the more we can use your previous work, the better it is for everybody, because we don't want to reinvent the wheel if you've already done it. But then you start to find out some people worked with a system, they were an administrator of a system in a previous life, but they didn't really know what the new systems were, and suddenly they were going to be the project manager for the new project here. There's also a misunderstanding. We get frustration from users, and we talked about this in the management slide a few slides earlier, but sometimes users come to us and say, look, I'm not being given any dispensation for this project. I'm being asked to add this to my workload, and it's going to drive me crazy because I work 60 hours a week as it is on some weeks, and now this is being dumped on me. How can I do a quality job? We are very cautious about companies that try to define requirements locally and then try to offshore them to have them develop, because there's this kind of actually synchronous, simplex communication, where the requirements are defined, they're shipped off overseas, work comes back, and it doesn't fit what the requirements were done. You like to have people that are kind of involved marshaling over the deployment of a system, because they understand the intimacy of the customer environment, and they're able to work through it and be able to apply what's being done to fixing the actual problems. And then we also get a position for management sometimes where, we've got rows and rows of systems analysts, and we just want to throw them at the project. And what we want to try to do is use them in every capacity that's going to make sense to the project, but not in such a way where you're expecting them to implement software like a condition consultant can, and you don't want them spending 10 times the amount of time to implement something a consultant could do, in a tenth the time. And it's better to have them learning and watching professional developers, and they become the super users for the later environment. So I guess where we're rounding up and trying to summarize here, that there is a realistic strategy that can be employed. And whether you use Astrix for these activities, whether you have people in place within your company that can do this kind of a process, we encourage you to use this process, because what it does is it gives you the best chance to be successful. And it also ties back the final state of the environment, the final environment that you implement, whether it be LIMS, whether it be clinical LIS, whether it be an ALN. It defines it in terms of things that everybody's agreed along the way will bring business process improvement to your company. So with that, I want to thank you, and if there are any questions that have been sent along the way, I'll answer them now. Also would like to mention that any questions sent that we can answer at a later time, we can do that as well.
Thank you very much, Randy. I do appreciate that. And what I want to do is pause the recording